I am sorry I was late. My father was having an issue, but I am here now. Probably missed my window for my usual audience, but that's okay. Um, let's do this, okay? It's Cosmic Skeptic. Here we go.
Judaism as a concept, one of the things that confuses a lot of people about it is the question of what it is. That is, are we talking about a religion? Are we talking about an ethnicity? Are we talking about a nation? Are we talking about a people? Like, what when someone says Judaism, what is the thing that they're talking about?
The problem,
All three.
the problem with answering that question is that these are all Western concepts, and Judaism precedes the invention of the West. And I am almost tempted to say all the things that it's not so that people will understand them what it is. It's not a race because you can't convert to be a race. It's not a religion because there are Jews who are not religious, but they're still Jews. There's no contradiction there. You're born Jewish, and you're not born Christian because you have to have a certain belief system.
You can be born Christian if you're Catholic. You can be baptized Christian. Orthodox, you can be. So Christianity, I guess I should say old form Christianity, pre-Reformation, was nationalistic. So you had different C's. So yes, you could totally be Christian by birth, and it's part of your national identity. Western Christianity kind of messed that up because Christendom ended up being including so many countries during the Papal State period and all this kind of stuff. But before nationality in that way was a thing, your ethnicity and your nationality was tied into your religion. It's Protestantism that changes that, but hey.
So maybe the best way to describe it is as a religious family. Because you're born into a family, you can join a family, and really the only way you leave a family is if you choose another family. And historically in the Jewish tradition, even though according to Jewish law, even if you convert, you're still considered Jewish, organically the community didn't accept people generally who converted to another religion.
Now, some people will say that Judaism is something you can never convert out of.
Right.
Once you're a Jew, you're always a Jew. Do you think that's true?
Well,
Same thing with Catholicism. You can never convert out. Once you're Catholic, you're always Catholic. And once you're Orthodox, you're always Orthodox as well.
That became an issue during the Spanish Inquisition, when so many Jews converted under duress that they used an old Talmudic principle, which reads, a Jew, even if he sins, is still a Jew, to refer to conversion, because they wanted to make it possible for those Jews to come back easily into Judaism and not to feel shame because what they did wasn't really of their own choice. And so that's become a sort of Jewish legal principle that you really can't convert out of Judaism. So that's the standard Jewish legal principle. But I mean, organically speaking, the truth is you can, because in a generation or two or three, people disappear.
And this is also going to depend on what kind of Judaism we're talking about, right? People will have different ideas about how to convert, if it's possible to convert, if it's possible to leave, what it really means. Maybe you can give us a quick overview of some of the principal different strands of Judaism and their approach to what it means to be a Jew.
So the principal strands of Judaism are Orthodoxy, Conservative, and Reform. The main difference is that the Reform movement accepts what's called patrilineal descent. That is, traditionally, being Jewish meant you were born of a Jewish mother. That made sense, of course, because you didn't know who
so
the
in
father.
Reform, I would be Jewish. In Orthodox, I am not Jewish.
Father was. You always knew who the mother was.
Because my paternal lineage is where my Judaism and Sephardicism comes from.
And so it is still true that if you're born of a Jewish mother or you convert to Judaism, traditional Jewish practice accepts you. The Reform movement decided that because so many people were raised in mixed households, and some of them were raised Jewish, that if you have a Jewish father and you're raised Jewish, they would consider you Jewish. So that's the principal division. And then there are, if you get down into the weeds, there are differences in the way people convert. But they're generally, what it involves is learning a mikveh, which is a ritual bath. It's like the precursor of baptism, and for a man, circumcision.
I find it interesting that somebody can be a completely non-religious Jew. Right, somebody can be completely atheist. They can never attend any kind of religious worship and not identify with any of the stories of Scripture. And yet their Judaism seems to be something they can't escape, which is the sense in which it is treated like an ethnicity. So there's an obvious sense in which you can't stop being a Jew when you sort of treat Judaism as an ethnicity. But I mean, do you think that's appropriate? I mean, like how do you sort of approach
it's
that?
what
fact?
Judaism is. That's why I said you're trying to put it into Western categories, but it doesn't fit. It's not an ethnicity. It's also not a religion. It's something that predates the concepts of ethnicity or religion. And that's why I use the word family. It's the best analogy that I can use. And the answer is, even if you leave your family and you don't see them for 30 years, and then one day you show up at the door, you're still family. And so I think that analogy works fairly well. It doesn't overlay perfectly, but it will serve.
But would you say, for example, I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking to Catholics, and because I was baptized and confirmed into Catholicism,
I was talking about this earlier.
and they say that at best, or at worst, I suppose, all I can ever really be is like a bad Catholic. Right? It doesn't sort of matter what I do. I've been confirmed. Like that's it. And I've always felt quite uncomfortable by that fact because I don't think I'm a Catholic.
Well, it's just like saying if you were born in America, you're always an American. It doesn't matter where you travel to, you're going to be an American. You're Ethiopian, you're going to be Ethiopian. Like you're just carrying your culture with you and the baggage of that with you. Your children might not have as much of that baggage, but it's still there.
I don't recognize that sort of sense of ownership of me in a group, you know. And I can imagine that for a lot of non-religious Jews, they say, look,
you're always going to be British, buddy.
I don't identify with a religious tradition. I don't believe in God. I don't go to the synagogue. None of that kind of stuff. I don't know. They might say, well, I don't want to be considered Jewish.
It is entirely possible that someone could say, I don't want to be considered Jewish. I feel as though my principles about how I see people in their groups and other people's principles about how they see themselves don't necessarily coincide. And in the Jewish tradition, you are Jewish if you're born Jewish. And even though you might wish to leave that. Now, the rabbis, meaning the rabbis of the Talmud, confronting this forensic difficulty, they decided that everybody's spirit was actually present at Sinai. So you see, you might not think that you signed on, but in fact you did. But practically speaking, I think this
sounds like in Islam where you're reverting.
This is also a historical development that so many Jews over pressure over so many years were either pushed out or enticed out or pressured out, that the Jewish community wanted to make a firm statement that actually you can't leave. You might think you can, but you can't, which was also a way of making it easy to come back. Because that same Jew who says, I don't want to be considered a Jew, if in a year they decide I do want to, they can walk into the synagogue and everyone will accept them.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago about this maternal lineage. One of the things that a lot of people do know about Judaism is that if your mother is Jewish, then you are Jewish. But it doesn't follow that if your father is Jewish, that you're Jewish too. And you implied a moment ago that this was sort of a practical measure because you always know who the mother is, you don't always know who the father is. Is that the origin of this?
Well, we don't know the origin for sure. I mean, in the Bible, it seems as though it's more patrilineal. It's like Jacob is right. So, and I think that that's in part because you brought women into the fold, so to speak. But it was probably at least had some origins in practicality around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, so the later biblical period, because in fact, when there was intermarriage and conversion and all those things, and people were leaving or coming, and you wanted to know if a child was Jewish or not, that was the way to know.
It just, I mean, it seems a little strange to me, and you're right that, concepts like religion, concepts like ethnicity, these are modern concepts, but I guess I'm trying to get this straight in my head, like, if I wanted to convert to Judaism, presumably that's an option that's open to me. I mean, is that an option that's open to me in all Jewish religious traditions, or are there traditions that say
in all Jewish religious traditions?
That
Always.
It doesn't sort of matter to whom I'm born. That doesn't matter at all. I can become a Jew. And what would that look like? Like, what would it require me to do? Would I have to sort of make a confession of things that I believe? Would I have to sort of just rethink my relationship with people? What would it mean?
So, depending on how you converted, whether you converted Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, the essentials would be that you would have to have some course of study. Some commitment to live Jewishly, and then how specific, how observant, how ritualistic that was depended on with whom you converted. And if you're a man, then traditionally you would have to be circumcised, which from the time of Paul has proved something of an obstacle, strangely enough.
Yeah, but, I can see that.
Yes.
And then if I did convert to Judaism and I'm now a Jew, will there be traditions that say, well, because you've converted to Judaism, now you can't leave? Or is it just the people who are sort of born into Judaism?
Once you're Jewish, you're fully Jewish.
And that would include, for example, if I had a wife who converted to Judaism and then had a child,
the child is
that
Jewish.
child is automatically Jewish. But,
Yes.
suppose that, I don't know, maybe You know, what if, you know, I have a wife and
Given that you believe human beings are exacerbated
then she gets pregnant, and then I decide, okay, I need to marry this woman and raise this child, and the child is born to a now Jewish mother, but at the time of the child's
Well,
conception,
you're marrying her doesn't make her Jewish.
or sorry, rather she
If she
converts to
converts-
Judaism like during her pregnancy.
Doesn't matter.
So
In fact, it's because, in part because in ancient times, again, the idea, for example, that you could artificially inseminate someone didn't exist. It was a question of giving birth.
Yeah.
So if you give birth as a Jew, the child is Jewish.
okay, because I find that quite interesting, given that there's a lot of debate, especially with sort of religious undertones, about where sort of life begins, when a child begins to be its own sort of separable person. And it seems to me that if you say that until that child is actually born, like if this mother converts to Judaism the day before she gives birth, then the child that comes out is Jewish. But if she converts a day afterwards,
Right.
that child is not. Does that seems to sort of maybe rub up against the religious intuition that that child is its own unique person long before the actual moment of birth?
Well, the child is always its own unique person, whether they're Jewish or not. But in terms of whether they belong to the people of the Jewish tradition, it depends whether they're born to someone who's part of that people. And if they don't, they can then join the people. You can convert an infant. What is interesting in the Jewish tradition is if you do convert an infant, at 13, that child has a right to renounce the conversion.
And is that not true of children who are born Jews?
That is not true of children who are born Jews.
Interesting. So
Because you made the choice on their behalf.
Yeah.
But the sort of metaphysical presumption is every Jew who's born Jewish made the choice back at Sinai on their
And
own.
that kind of coincides with confirmation in Catholicism, and I'm not sure if Orthodoxy has confirmation.
Right. That's so fascinating, because I'm sort of imagining this pregnant woman, and sort of she wants to convert to Judaism, and I don't know, there's probably some ceremony involved. There's some moment, and suppose she says, you know, I'm going to convert to Judaism because I want my child to be Jewish, and then, you know, the rabbi comes along and says, you know, sorry, something's come up, we have to delay this for 2 days, and then she gives birth,
And then she gives birth.
and then
So
she
then the
converts,
child would have to be
and suddenly
converted.
now the child
This
at
is-
13,
this is part of it.
everything
Right.
changes, you know.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, I don't know of an instance actually of a child of 13 who actually renounced their. But this is part of and you're very familiar with this in 1,000 different ways. It is almost impossible in slippery slope arguments to make distinctions that always hold and always make sense. So you say like a day before the child is, you know, is not, the mother isn't Jewish, and then the day after is, all of those sorts of things are capable of infinite slicing. So at some point, any tradition, any legal system has to say, this is the point at which things change, especially if they're remediable.
Yeah.
Because if a child is born not Jewish, you can change it.
It seems, you know, as arbitrary to me as like the fact that if you're born on US soil, you're
Right,
a US
exactly.
citizen, right? It sort of depends when you get on the plane. But this to me gets at this confusion that can arise when trying to consider what Judaism is. And the word sort of ethno-religious is often thrown around.
Well, if you think it's a condition of soul,
Yeah.
then it's very confusing. But if you think what it is like citizenship, then
Yeah.
it's not so confusing.
I think that's probably right. I mean,
I don't know if
it
that's
seems to
right.
me that if,
Something
you know, if
about
we're
that
talking about
bothered
like
me.
ethnicity or race, you know, if two Rwandan parents have a child, it sort of doesn't matter when that child's born. There's no sort of slippery slope confusion, because the child that comes out,
Again, you're confusing nationality and ethnicity. You seem to have a problem distinguishing between the two.
is just going to be
I'm always
Rwandan.
going to be Hispanic. I'm always going to be a little Jewish. I'm always going to be a little French. It's always going to be part of my genetics. And if we can go back, I can just go back to about 100 years before the Reconquista. It's as far back as I can go with my family lineage. But I can go pretty far back.
No matter what, nothing changes there.
If they're in Rwanda at the time. But if they're in America
I mean,
at the time, right.
like in terms of their race and
always gonna be
ethnicity,
Native
rather than their
American
nationality,
on my
right? Like that's
mother's
just what that child is going to be.
But Judaism does not work that way.
However, when it comes to, so that's
So for those that speaking about ethnicity, so on my mother's side, I'm Native American and French. On my father's side, I'm Native. I'm going to say Native Mexican, but it's a tribe in San Luis Potosi. But I'm Native, and I'm Spaniard on both sides, with both sides of my paternal grandparents, and with Sephardic, being Sephardic on both sides as well, and also French. There we go. So I have French on both sides. On both my mother and my father's side, I have French. I have native blood, but from two different tribes from both sides. And then from both of my paternal grandparents, I have Sephardic, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, from two different regions. So yeah, so. But I can track down my father's lineage, like I said, to about 100 years before the Reconquista.
Why, Judaism doesn't work like an ethnicity. So some people might then say, well, okay, well, it's more like a religion then. But then also no, because like you can't sort of be inescapably born religious if religion is a...
And so you have, in my family history, you have Catholicism, whatever the natives practice, if there was any kind of religion in the region where I'm from. You have, I guess it'd be some kind of Incan Mayan religion, San Luis Potosí. I think the religion is actually still practiced there, with the natives there. You have Judaism on both sides, Sephardic. And then before that, presumably, either Goth or Visigoth, going all the way back to either Rome or possibly, if the Sephardic lineage is legit, not meaning my Sephardic lineage, but meaning like the actual claims of Sephardism is correct, then going all the way back to Jerusalem. So, yeah.
It is a sort of a product of what you believe about the world, right? And so it sort of doesn't fit neatly into either category. That's true, but you see why this is confusing for people?
Of course.
In trying to work out what this thing
Of course.
is?
That's why I use the family analogy.
And I think that's an interesting thing, that as an American, most Americans are mutts like me. We're a mixture. You have Irish, Scottish, which you can't tell exactly which lineage you came from. You got blended, blended whiskey, if you will. And that's how it is for a lot of us. So I think it's interesting how that works. How in a culture where there's more homogeny, there's questioning of how to dissect identity. And when in cultures that have more mixing, more melting pot, we're not as concerned. It's only those who are, really haven't dabbled that are concerned about their purity and identity.
Because it's the best one I have. But it's also why there's so much misunderstanding about what Jews are, because Christians use Christian categories which don't fit. And it's also, by the way, and I think this is worth mentioning, it also explains certain differences between Judaism and Christianity that people may observe but don't fully understand. One is, it's one of the reasons why Christianity is a much more transportable religion. It's built to be universal in a way that Judaism isn't. But on the other hand, it's why Judaism is a much more connected religion. So, for example, when the Soviet Union persecuted Jews, they also persecuted Christians, but there was no worldwide Christian movement to save the Christians of the Soviet Union. But there was a worldwide Jewish movement. Why? Because there is this kinship sense that Christians don't feel with one another.
Say that to Rome.
That Jews do feel with one another, and it's a result of this different kind of origin. There's more to say about that, but I think that helps people understand it's not purely a declaration of faith. It is a sort of membership in what Jews think of as an eternal people.
Do I need to believe in God to be Jewish?
No.
Ask that to a rabbi.
There are many Jews who don't.
Do I need to...
I suggest
Ask that to an Orthodox rabbi, I should say.
But you don't have to.
Do I need to believe in God to convert to Judaism?
Depends with whom you convert, actually. There are some Jewish, I don't want to say groups, ideologies, whatever, that would say you don't, and others that would say you do.
Interesting. I guess I'm sort of maybe perhaps inappropriately or unfairly trying to get to grips with what the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions are for Judaism here. Like you talked earlier about this.
I would say the greatest condition is you want to throw your lot in with the destiny of the Jewish people.
Right.
That's what you're asked again and again.
So it's sort of it's like an attachment to a people rather than a system of beliefs.
In fact,
so on this guy, this is not my first watch through. The video was the first watch. That's not a first watch through. There's a lot that he says that I don't agree with in the beginning, a lot that I don't agree with at the end, but pretty much in the chunk in the middle, there's a lot that I agree with. So he gets a lot right, especially on the Bible, at least from my perspective. But he gets a lot of identity politics stuff mixed in, and he has again, that Anglo-Saxon Protestant understanding of what religion is, which is kind of sad considering that he's Jewish. And Alex O'Connor is just being Alex O'Connor.
Yes, it involves a system of beliefs. But if you look even at the classic example of conversion, which is Ruth in the Bible, she says, your people shall be my people and your God shall be my God. She precedes people to God, which
Interesting.
is
Yeah.
reverse of the way Christianity would put it.
Yeah.
No.
Well, this.
In Christianity, we are a people. We are a chosen people. We are grafted into the vine. It's only Protestantism that has a problem with the distinctions.
Sort of theme of the chosen people of
We are a
God
family.
is like the theme of the Hebrew Bible. And
Brothers and sisters.
it does seem strange to me, I must say. And I speak to a lot of my Christian friends about this. We sort of say, how do you feel about Judaism? And they say, well, obviously we're not Jews, but Judaism is very special. It's obviously attached to Christianity. The Hebrew Bible is their Old Testament. It's still part of their scripture. But a lot of them have said to me, but to be honest, I haven't really got my head around this, and I can't really figure out what's going on when God says, this God that I believe in, God of love, God who wants to come to know everybody, creates everyone in his image, says, but these people are my favorite.
Oh, he doesn't say favorite.
So what does it mean to
Doesn't say
be
favorite.
the chosen people?
It means you have a certain responsibility in the world, a certain mission in the world. In fact,
I agree with that.
I had this, and by the way, it's the favorite there. So I'll tell you one story and then say something specifically Christian Jewish. I remember once my brother is a professor at Emory, and so is the Dalai Lama. He no longer goes because he's older, but so my brother was bringing a bunch of students to meet with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, and I met them there. And so my brother and I had an audience with his wife, with the Dalai Lama, not with the Dalai Lama's wife, with my brother's wife. And as we sit down, and when I was there, I actually gave a lecture to the monks in Tibet about how you survive in exile, because they were all in exile. But when we sat down, the first thing, as he opened the conversation, he pointed at me and said, what's this about the chosen people anyway?
Yeah.
So I said, it's true. Jews believe they have a special mission in the world. I said, but that doesn't mean that other peoples don't have a special mission. We assume other peoples probably think they're chosen too. And he bursts out laughing and goes, yeah, we also think we're special.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know of a people that don't think they're special, even though the Jews always get this. If you ask the Albanians, are Albanians special?
Yeah.
I'm sure they will say, yes, Albanians are special. And the other piece of this is that I must confess irks me a little bit sometimes in conversations with Christians who have a hard time with the chosen people idea. Here's another theological difference between classical Christianity and Judaism. In order to be saved, you must believe in Jesus. If you don't, you're damned. Judaism does not have that. In the Jewish tradition, if you are a good person, you get whatever the world to come is, which is a separate question. But whatever it is, you get that. So in fact, I think chosenness has less consequences eternally for Jews than belief in Jesus does for Christians. But nobody says to Christians, how dare you have this tremendous hubris that you think only people who believe like you can be saved.
I think there's a extent to which belief in Jesus, and I don't know if Christians would be happy with the idea of it being belief in Jesus. It might, I mean, a lot of people say you don't need to know who Jesus is to be saved, this kind of thing. But
Acceptance of Jesus.
But sure,
let's say.
acceptance of
Okay.
Jesus,
Right.
acceptance of a message, of a sacrifice. But there seems to be a level of autonomy there where somebody can,
Where you can
to some
convert.
degree, choose to do that or
You
choose
can
not
choose
to do
to be
that. But
Jewish. We just went through this.
It
It takes a
seems-
little more work, but you can do the same thing.
It seems like, at least in the Hebrew scriptures, God here is building something akin to a nation,
Yeah.
a nation of people, and that seems
But many people in the scriptures join that nation. Many different people do,
Sure.
who don't start out being part of that nation. So again,
yeah. I mean, this will definitely require the idea that becoming a Jew is analogous to becoming Christian, where it's something that you can sort of choose to do. You can choose
Yes.
to join up. It might be
Right.
a difference in what you have to, the kind of
Exactly.
thing you have to accept, but something that you can do. Because I think the problem people will have is that if God has chosen a people and that people is identified with something like the modern concept of ethnicity, then that starts getting very troublesome
it
very
does.
quickly.
But think of it this way. So I say to my organization, we have a special mission in the world, members of party X, Y, or Z, and you're special because you're going to be the ones who are save American democracy, party X. And then someone comes along and says, how could you be so conceited as to say they're the ones who are going to save democracy? I would say, because that's what their mission is. If you want to join them, and you can be part of the ones that save democracy too, or whatever the mission is. So I don't see that as at all a statement of racial or ethnic superiority.
So this concept of chosen people is about sort of duty, and it's sort of something you can join. And I can sort of see what you're saying there, but like when I look in the Hebrew Bible and I see some of the stories of what this nation got up to, I said that I wanted to talk about some.
But you're understanding the Bible through a Protestant lens, which is weird because you say that you grew up Catholic. So I wonder why you're stuck viewing the Bible through a Protestant lens and not through a Jewish lens or a Catholic lens. That's very interesting.
Some of these stories. I've been speaking a lot recently to Christians about some of the Old Testament atrocities, is the label that would often be put on them. And for them, it's easy enough for them to sort of say, well, Jesus is kind of a part two and it sort of undoes it. And we have a very special relationship with these stories. But I think you'll have to answer differently, which is why I'm interested to ask you about these things. So, God has this chosen people and he promises them a land. And that land is occupied. Already there are people living there. And so God sends his...
This is where it really starts to get interesting, because I start agreeing with what the rabbi here says, and honestly, he's giving answers that I would give as a Catholic. So it's interesting that O'Connor can't seem to hear or understand what he's saying. He has a lot of trouble processing. He really is stuck in a Protestant literalism mind frame, and if he truly grew up Catholic, I don't understand why.
People to occupy this land, and when the people refuse to give it to them,
that's not me doubting the veracity of his spoken history. It's just saying that it's a weird problem to have if you grew up Catholic.
Getting slaughtered, men, women, children. I'm talking about the Canaanites, of course. You have these stories of the Amalekites, you have the stories of the Midianites, and Moses or his successors and their armies are commanded to march up to this land and told in no uncertain terms to kill men, women, children, animals. In Samuel, we have the story of the sort of this instruction to slaughter animals, and when they keep the king and some of the animals alive, God says to Samuel, I regret that I ever made Saul king because he didn't follow my instructions. It's like he gets punished for not killing all of the animals. Now, this idea of a sort of chosen people with a special duty that people can sort of come along and say, yeah, I like what you're doing, I want to get on board, that seems pretty fine. But this idea that I'm reading in this text, there's a chosen people with their promised land, and if you're not okay with that, then you're going to get killed. That seems a little bit more raw to me. I wondered how you interpret that part of the chosen people story.
No, there are multiple really interesting and important questions here. One is, let's start first with the difference between Christianity and Judaism.
Sure.
The reason that Christianity is not, the New Testament does not have stories like that is precisely because it was born in the Roman Empire. So there were no wars, there was no contention.
That's bullshit. Christianity was full of conflict. Christianity comes out of Judaism and suffered persecution, and there was plenty of war, not just between Christians and pagans, and then between Christians and Christians. So this understanding is incorrect.
There was no civil legislation. It's one of the reasons why Christianity is such an internal religion, is because if you create a religion in the desert...
Not pre-1556 or 1552. Pre-1500s, that's not what's going on. And we do have the Desert Fathers. We have our own desert traditions.
Like Moses or like Muhammad, then your civil legislation and your religious legislation are one. They're the same. There's no separation between church and state because you're creating a religious civilization. Christianity was spared that phase of history, and as a result, Christians...
No, because we have the Crusades, we have the Reconquista, we have holy wars going on right now, I think, in Africa. So no, this is a wrong answer.
Didn't have civil legislation as part of Jesus's legislation because obviously the Roman Empire took care of all of that. They didn't have a land that they wanted to conquer or not conquer, although clearly the revolts against Rome were, at least in part, some of the toxicity that you see in the New Testament towards Jews were about the revolts against Rome and the anger against Rome. But in the Hebrew Bible, you have an ancient people and a chronicle of what probably happened over and over and over and over and over again with virtually every...
I would say through the church fathers and through Eusebius, especially the earlier church fathers, you do have sort of a record of Christianity's journeys. It makes me wonder if in another 2,000 years, maybe some of those books might become holy books in a way.
Ancient people. I don't think the story of the Israelites is unique, except that they survived for thousands and thousands of years. But I think that that's how, and by the way, if you look in the book of Joshua, the actual conquest of the land is a much more assimilative process than it is actual conquering of the land. So it's almost like the rhetoric is much more martial than the reality. But I think that this is precisely because that was how, look, I'm not someone who thinks that God wrote every word of the Bible. And I think that this is exactly how ancient Israelites interpreted their own mandate, was just like the tribes around them who conquered land one from the other. They conquered as well. And you could either join them or not join them and have a war, just as all subsequent attempts to destroy them were men, women, children. That was the way, unfortunately, war worked often in the ancient world and sometimes in the modern.
But when we think of this nation of Israel as God's chosen people, with direct access to the commands of the moral author of the universe, when people say,
Who's the we? Am I included in that?
well,
we?
no, not
Right.
not you, not me, but the
Well, the reason I say that is
prophets.
because
To be fair, Christians currently have direct access to God.
actually don't think that God said to them directly, kill men, women, and children. I think that the Bible's a
I agree.
product of human beings, inspired by God, trying to struggle with God's meaning. But clearly it is an ancient text from an ancient people that intermixes stunning moral insights
And it doesn't
and
mean
spirit.
that he didn't. It just means that we can't tell. We don't know. We don't know how much of that is human understanding, human interpretation. So, yeah. And the fact that some of those events may not have even happened. So, yeah, it's more complicated than that.
Actual truths with the realities
People
of a
trying to
very
contextualize
ancient
the history
world.
that they understand.
Of course, points in the Hebrew Bible, we have the recorded voice of God
Yes.
telling the nation of Israel to do what I would consider to be some quite intolerably unethical war practices. Would you say that, I mean, you just said a moment ago you don't believe that God wrote every word of the Bible. I think that, of course, the Hebrew Bible as a whole shouldn't be treated as if God wrote every word, but those instances
Well,
where
actually, that's how the Jewish tradition traditionally saw it, as God wrote every word. And what I'm saying is the modern understanding of the Bible is that it's written by human beings. It developed over a long period of time. And that some of their understandings of what God wants, I think, are the understandings of people who lived thousands of years ago. And I use the Bible's own principles to criticize the Bible.
So where the Bible tells us, God said these words, it's not sort of a narrative. I mean, it's not sort of,
Right.
Even something like the Genesis story, like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It'd be weird if like God said those words, like I can sort of understand that. But where the Hebrew Bible says, these are the words that God spoke
Right.
to Moses, for
Right.
example. Are you telling me that you're happy to sort of read that and say, well, maybe they just recorded it wrong? Maybe God didn't say these things?
Not at all. They recorded it wrong. I'm
That's
not a
what they
literalist.
understood.
Sure.
It is that this is what they understood God to want of them.
Correct.
And I think that as a people who lived in a very different universe from the universe we live in, what they understood God to want of them is not at all what we always understand God to want of us. And so it's not as though, oh my God, I got it wrong. It's rather that the Bible, which spans, by the way, some 1,000 years of writing, was a gradual process. And you can even see inside the Bible criticism of the Bible. It's why some of the later writings don't accord
Which
with
I've
earlier
said this
writings.
a lot, and a lot of people, even some of the scholars that I've interacted with, and some of the academia, don't seem to get that either. Is that the Bible itself is recontextualizing itself, and we're allowed to do that. The Bible is allowed to recontextualize itself, and we, as Christians who claim it as our book, are allowed to do so. You can call it dogmatic framing, you can call it a univocal voice, whatever you want to call it, but we believe in inspiration. Jewish people believe that it's the Word of God. I as a Christian, believe it's the Word of God. We believe that there's a true message there, and we believe that the history of the Jewish people is giving us a true message. So, I have a problem when people have a problem with what exactly he's saying, because I agree with this part 100%.
Writings, because this is a process of coming to grips with and understanding God, which takes a long time, and under duress tends to be less.
And I think this is a much better explanation of this situation than Trent Horn gives, because Trent Horn's example is somewhat insulting and patronizing, especially the Jewish people. I think this is a much better version of the same point.
There's less fidelity
Much
to
better
what
illustration.
we understand to be God's will than when situations are better.
So how do you specifically interpret these passages? I mean, maybe for the sake of the audience and for the sake of our own sort of context here, I can point to some directly. Some of the ones that I've been raising as objections in my debates with Christians, for example, would include Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 onwards. When you march up to attack a people, to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all of the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace with you, bearing in mind that peace is forced labor, and engage in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord has given you from your enemies. It then continues, however, in the nations that the Lord God has given you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, so on, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they'll teach you to follow the detestable things that they do in worshipping their gods and sin against the
I
Lord your God.
interpret them exactly the way I just said, which is that was how an ancient people in war behaved, and they understood that to be God's will.
But do you think God issued this command? I mean,
I don't know how many times I've said several times, no. I think that human beings wrote that book.
I say we don't know. That's what I would say. I would say we cannot tell how much is inspiration and how much is the author's imagination. So we accept it as it is, and that's what the book says.
Inspired sometimes by God, sometimes not, sometimes recording exactly what ancient people said. But no, I don't think God spoke. I'm not a literalist. I don't think God spoke those words. I think human beings wrote the Bible, and they often in
Correct.
in the
But
Bible
I do
instantiate.
believe that inspiration we can't tell which is which. So, well, I agree with him. I just wouldn't go as far, just because I don't know how to parse that out.
What their desires were and projected them onto God, which people have a tendency to do.
Okay, so I'm fine with that, and I'm sorry if I make you feel like you're repeating yourself. I'm trying to get to grips with the people.
Well, your assumption, I think that the disconnect here is that you represent a tradition, not you, but you're representing a tradition that doesn't allow for the critical study of the Bible that starts with the assumption, which is what I start with, that human beings wrote this book.
Yeah, sure, okay.
And once you start with that assumption, you read the passages very differently than if you start with the assumption that God wrote this book. Now you have to explain to me why God did those terrible things. I just don't make that assumption.
I think what I want to know is your opinion on, I mean, you said that this is people sort of investing their own motivations and ideas into the words of God. The people, and maybe we just don't know, but the people who did write these words down, the people who did sort of commit these words to tradition or to paper eventually, do you think they were at least honestly attempting to say this is what we actually think God said? Or do you think that it was more an attempt to represent their own ideas?
I can't know for sure, but I think that they were. I think that this is what they really believed God wanted them to do. And part of the reason that I believe that is because we see that same sort of belief persists today.
Sure.
That people really believe what God wants of me is to destroy these people and to take what they have because it should be mine. So I think that that's a very powerful and enduring human desire. The difference in part is that the Bible, it still exists and that we see it laid out so clearly. The reason that the Bible is because right next to such objectionable passages are passages not only of great moral beauty, but of these kind of transcendent principles that we have absorbed so much that we can criticize the Bible based on the Bible's own principles.
So people attempting to record what they think God might have said, but really probably it just imparting their own values and ideas into the word.
No, it's their best understanding of what God said. It's their best understanding at that time. Based on the full inspiration of God, based on what they understood, based on them looking back at history, at events that may or may not have happened, but they think they had those happen. They're looking at the world around them, and they're writing a story based on the information that they have. They're doing the best they can to tell the whole truth as they understand it at that time.
Words of God. I suppose the question that people really want answered when they find this in Scripture, people who are troubled by this, is like, well, however this...
And that is still truth. If I tell you, to my best understanding, about, I don't know, what's the equivalent time? Let's say 500 years ago. If I'm going to tell you an absolutely 100% true story from 500 years ago about my family, to the best of my ability, of what I understand about history, and I do all the research I can, even with all the modern technology, what I'm telling you is truth. But it might not be accurate to the actual historical record because I don't know. I can only go so far. But I can tell you based on the best of my ability. There might be other historians who can do better research, who can tell a better story of the actual context, but not of my family. So they might get the historical context better, but they might not get the story of my family better. Get it? The story of the Jewish people, which now includes Christians, according to Christians. And there's some conflict there between Christians and Jews on how that works and whether or not that's true or not.
This did end up in Scripture, whether it was really the word of God or not. Is this the kind of thing that God could, in principle, have said? Because if the answer to that is no, then the people who wrote this down trying to record what God said must have made a mistake.
Yes. Oh, I think they clearly. Oh, well, I think a mistake is probably not the word that I would use. If you ask me, is the God that I understand as God, which is already in some ways a ridiculous statement to make because to understand God is I sometimes say to our teens, like, when you were 2, could you understand a 15-year-old? And obviously you can't. And the distance between God and human beings in my tradition is much greater than that between a 2 and a 15-year-old. So when I say what I understand is God, it's kind of silly, but nonetheless, the God as I understand God would never say such a thing. And of course, the people who wrote it, who really believed they were.
Well, I don't see. I kind of disagree with him there, because it's not impossible for God to give a command. So if He gives a command, you follow. The hard part is knowing whether or not it's a command from God, or if you're just delusional, or if it's a demon, or if you're just talking to yourself.
Expressing the highest values that they knew and believed that God had given them those values and that voice. I think they were completely sincere. I find it very hard to believe that people wrote stuff like that and thought, we're going to put one over on the future and tell them God said
of course.
it.
But to be clear, I want to make sure sure I'm understanding you correctly. In all of the instances across the Hebrew Bible where these kinds of issues are these kinds of commands are issued,
you have to address specific issues.
Okay, sure.
So it's but if you're talking
pushback.
about
I like that
massacres
pushback there. I wish more Christians did that.
of innocence, do I believe that that's what God wants of us? No, I don't.
Right. And so how would you approach the criticism that people listening to this might then have that seems to imply that when they're reading the Hebrew Bible, they need to keep in mind that some of the things that are recorded in there are, well, you didn't like the word mistaken, but not really what God said,
right.
basically.
I completely agree with that.
And does that undermine our trust of the Hebrew Bible as a whole?
I think, well, if what you need to believe in the Bible is a literal understanding of the Bible, it absolutely undermines.
What you need is a literal 100%, not just literal, but ultra realism in the Bible. Then I just think you don't have good comprehension, and you don't have good context clues. And I don't mean that as an insult. I'm not saying that you're an idiot or that you're dumb. I'm saying that you don't have a good grasp of analogy and metaphor, and those things frustrate you. And so a book as deep and as rich as the Bible, and what I think is a literary achievement as deep as the Bible, is above your ability to understand, and that's fine. I think, and this might be controversial, but I think Islam is going to one day have a great awakening where they're going to look back at the text, and it's going to go back to the way it was, not Islam, the religion, but their understanding is going to go back to the way it was during their scientific revolution, when they were the ones preserving all the Greek and Roman writings. And I think that is going to happen, and they will turn away from literalism. Because they have to. They have to adapt to the world as it is. Because the Quran is covering a shorter period of time, and they're able to be a little bit more historically accurate with the battles. It might not be as stressful or as necessary once they stop over-stressing and over-emphasizing the hadith. But I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with Islam in that way. So, but yeah, I do think there's a lot there. There's a lot of play here. And I think if we look at the Talmud, and we look at the Talmud, and we look at the way that Jewish rabbis interpret the Bible, you look at some of the rabbinical schools that come out now, and some of the rabbinical teachings that you can go see online that are not Orthodox, that are Reformed. This change is coming. It's going to come for Islam. It's already happening in Judaism. It's already happening. It happened with Vatican II, with Catholicism. It's happening right now with the Protestants, and the Protestants are having a hard time with it. I mean, they're going all the way. It's not just liberal theology or liberation theology. I mean, they're going far woke. I mean, so Protestants are having a hard time with this, but it's coming for them too. So, yeah.
Finds it, no question. And this is, by the way, a process that I've seen again and again and again. When people start to study, for example, modern criticism of the Bible, where you start to see literary tropes, and that different parts of the Bible use different levels of Hebrew language. So that, for example, when we were testing the microphones, you started to repeat one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and anybody listening could tell, oh, that's not something that he made up.
Right. Yeah.
And the same thing happens in the Hebrew Bible. You see levels of different ages of Hebrew. So once that happens, people all of a sudden, there's a sort of shattering effect. Like, oh my God, I thought this was exactly what God said, and now I see it as partly a product of the human, or maybe fully a product of the human aspiration for God, but not what God said. And then you have to have a different kind of religious approach from the approach of someone whom I'm calling a literalist. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't speak Hebrew or read Hebrew. And so when I learnt that a lot of the Hebrew Bible does sort of switch as if you were reading an English text that suddenly.
Now, I don't know how I knew that. I knew this. I know this for a very long time. I don't think it's something that I just simply read. I think one of the translations that I have tries to imitate that change. And that's how I was aware of that with the Bible.
Switch to speaking in Shakespearean English,
Right.
you would just be struck by this knowledge that you're reading an amalgamation of,
Yes.
of texts and authors. But because it all gets translated into one English text for me to read, that doesn't come through, which is fascinating. It does seem to me, I mean, the Hebrew Bible, maybe we should spend just a moment spelling out what it is. I mean, there are words thrown around: Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, Pentateuch,
Okay,
Torah.
so the Hebrew
People might
Bible
be
is what's
confused.
called a step canon,
Yeah.
by which I mean it has 5 books, the Torah, and those are considered the most important. Then there are Nevi'im, which means the prophets, but it actually includes the historical books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, all of those books, and also the prophets that everyone who's biblically literate
Right.
has heard of: Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, so on, and the 12 minor prophets. And then there are what are called the writings, the Ketuvim. And those are all the other books. They're Daniel, Jonah, Ruth, Esther, on, Proverbs, Psalms, Job. And so that's why it's Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. It's called Tanakh in Hebrew. And the only reason we refer to it as the Hebrew Bible is because that distinguishes it. Jews don't obviously like to call it the Old Testament because that implies
Yes,
there's a new
of
one.
course. Yeah. But the Hebrew Bible is what Christians would call the Old Testament.
Right, exactly.
And it's made up of different parts.
Exactly.
And I'm interested in this because I speak a lot about the genre of scripture and the genre of different books within the sort of biblical canon. And so a moment ago when you said, well, look, I'm not a biblical literalist. I don't read this taking every single word as if it came out of God's mouth. But it seems to me that there are different intentions with different genres of different texts.
I agree.
So, for example, when I read the book of Genesis, I think I'm dealing with obvious mythology. That's not an insult. I mean to say it's a genre of text of mythology. When I read something like Exodus, it seems to be more historical. But certainly when there's a part of the textual canon which you just said contains the histories,
Right.
the fact that there's a distinguishably sort of historical set of texts says to me that when you're reading those texts, it would make sense to say, well, in this instance, we should be more literal, at least in the sense of thinking that this is attempting to describe actual history. Because when you say
I think that's
biblical
true.
literalism,
I think that's true. For example, I wrote a book about David, for
Yeah.
example. When you read the story of David in Samuel, it's very close to modern histories. Now, it also obviously involves God as a character in that book, but nonetheless, it feels, I agree with you, very different from reading Abraham's story and much closer to what we understand as a biography.
right, sure. Yeah. And so when you say that, when you're reading a book that's more obviously historical, when you say, well, I don't read it as a literalist, what does it mean to read a historical text as a non-literalist?
Well, there are, I think, two parts.
I think that's a good question, but it's also a misunderstanding of what's being talked about. I think he's close, but he's just not there. Meaning O'Connor.
Not sure which one, I'm not sure which would be your follow-up question to this, but I will say, if the follow-up question is, if it's a historical text and God speaks, does that give it more credibility than if it's a mythological text and God speaks? I would say no.
Okay.
But if you're asking, is it more likely that it records actual historical events? My answer would be just that. It is more likely. Is it?
Sure.
But did, for example, the court historian of David, who wrote the books of Samuel, was he as exercised as a modern historian about whether, in fact, the dialogue was exactly right? I think probably not. So,
How do you interpret the book of Job? Job, I mean, I consider it to be probably in the category of myth. I don't know if you wouldn't like that sort of that genre delineation. But I mean, it reads to me, most people will be familiar with the story, if not the dialogues that make up the bulk of the middle, of sort of this council, of this like divine council,
Right.
and the accuser comes along,
Yes.
identified as Satan. And they sort of have this bet over this guy Job, this very devout individual who worships.
Join large-scale battles with military vehicles. The online action game War Thunder has received a major update. Direct Hit. Joining the battle are machines like the...
God, and Satan says, well, he only worships you because you're so good to him, and God essentially over a series of stages gives him the ability to just wreck Job's life.
Right.
And his like wife dies, kids die, house,
His wife doesn't
everything-
die, his
sorry,
kids die.
everything just sort of like gets taken from him and destroyed, and he spends the majority of the book, in fact, just like speaking with his friends, and they're saying, well, you must have sinned against God, or maybe, and eventually God finally gives Job this audience, and instead of explaining why it's happened, instead of giving him any kind of justification for the behaviors of Satan, he just says, well, who the hell are you? Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? And Job is seemingly so terrified by this that he sort of instantly realizes that it was a stupid thing to even ask, and repents in dust and ashes. The irony of this story for me is that the audience is told why this has happened to Job. We're told exactly why this is happening. And yet when Job says, why is this happening, Lord? God says, well, how the hell do you think you could even possibly understand? And yet as a reader, we're sort of being told what the reason is. And so it seems to me, a lot of atheists read the story as like God sort of toying with Job and being sort of the evil one in the story, the bad guy. And then when Job quite
I think O'Connor has completely the wrong perspective. And he has to understand that it's coming from an older tradition. And it's explaining something. It's something that the Jewish people saw value in. And so they adapted the story into their tradition.
Asks for a response. God says, well, who the hell are you?
So in order to give you a proper answer, I have to make two literary distinctions. One is that most biblical scholars modern biblical scholars think that the prologue and the epilogue were written after. Right. And the poetry is actually, and the character of Job was a character that was known in the ancient Near East. That is a suffering person who suffers unjustly. And so the Bible takes this character and tries to give the biblical answer. And I think that the biblical answer actually is not exactly the one that is usually assumed, which is, Job, you're an idiot, you can't understand. And the reason I say that in part, it's more complicated, but to put a point on it, God says to Job at a certain point, your friends have not spoken the truth about me as you have. And what's the truth that Job spoke that they didn't? The truth that Job spoke is, I didn't deserve to suffer. They kept saying, you did. And he kept saying, no, I didn't. I mean, maybe I did a little bad, but I didn't do this. And then God says, you were right and they were wrong. And so I think what the Bible is trying to say is, there actually is, according to the human perception of suffering, there is unjust suffering in this world. And although we may not know why, it is true, and we can call it unjust suffering, and God doesn't get off the hook for everything, because Job was right. He didn't deserve it.
Now, for a lot of people, for a lot of religious people, suffering in this world, unjust suffering, unmanageable suffering, the thought of it is that there's some consolation to be taken from the fact that this is all heading towards some kind of salvation, some kind of afterlife, some kind of enjoyment of God in heaven where you're sort of compensated, or maybe you're suffering because you deserve to suffer because you're a sinner and we live in a fallen world and Jesus is going to come and take that sacrifice for you. What does Judaism offer as a response to the sufferings of the world?
First of all, Judaism does actually believe in a world to come. It doesn't elaborate it nearly as much as Christianity does. It just speaks about it in those sort of general terms. In part, I think, because it's very hard to describe a plausible vision of heaven. You know, in Letters from Earth, Mark Twain says people think that they're going to lie on green fields and listen to harp music, and they wouldn't want to do it for 5 minutes while they're alive, but they think they'll be happy for the rest of eternity doing it after they die. I think that the reason that it, for example, is not really mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, except for one or two slight, like Daniel chapter 12 and one mentioned in Isaiah, is that you really should keep these two things distinct. That is there unjust suffering in the world? Yes. There is. And you should not belittle the suffering by saying, oh, but it's going to be fine. Because that's a diminishment of the human experience of real suffering, and it's too easy. But does Judaism believe that human beings have a spark of God in them that is eternal? Absolutely. And so do I. So I would say both things are true. And my only explanation for why, and it is hardly adequate, but when people say, why is there unjust suffering in the world? The only worthy explanation that I know of is what's basically called dysteleological suffering. Since you were a philosophy major, I'll give you the term. It's suffering for no reason. And that is the only kind of suffering that enables goodness. Because if you know that when you're good, you'll get rewarded, and every time you steal, you'll get a disease, you'd never steal. But your goodness would be purely prudential. It would not be moral. The only way to be morally good is to not know what's going to happen to you, even though you're morally good. And so I think that that's why there's unjust suffering in the world, because the world is a great moral drama, and that's what we're supposed to be doing.
You know, it's fascinating. For all the time I've spent talking about the problem of evil, I don't think I've heard this response in conversation before. It's not a kind of attempt to justify suffering by saying, like, well, more goods come out of it, or, oh, it has to be there for free will, or this kind of stuff. It's like, a lot of people parody the religious by saying, oh, you're telling me that the only thing stopping you from going and, shooting up a school is the fact that God doesn't want you to. Well, that's terrible. That's terrifying. Does that mean that if I turn you into an atheist, you're going to go and do that? Like, no, you want to do that anyway, right? And there is this problem as well of there being no such thing as altruism,
exactly, right.
giving some money to the homeless person because you would feel so bad. I mean, if you see
I do feel that's one of the problems that Protestants also get wrong, is that they can't view people doing anything good.
The example of like a firefighter running into a building to save a child, being sort of interviewed by the news afterwards, and he says, well,
eyes of God, or doesn't mean that it's going to save them or get them to heaven, but just generally what people think are good, people doing good on their own based on what they understand good to be. Yeah, people do that all the time.
Just, I didn't even think about it. I had to do it. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. And we go, what a hero. But what's he just said? He said he's done it for his own sake, I couldn't have slept at night if I
Yes,
didn't
but
do
that's
this,
the definition of a good person is somebody whose moral impulses are what motivate them. If you want, it's impossible to ask of someone to do that which they would by definition not do.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the idea that the reason suffering, or unnecessary suffering, exists is because if it didn't, then people would be secure in the consequences of their actions, and it wouldn't leave room for doing things
We'd
for
be
their own
rats in a
sake.
Skinner box,
Yeah,
basically.
that's interesting. I think there's a whole philosophical discourse to be had as to whether that is a preferable world over the one that doesn't have any suffering, but
That
doesn't
is,
have that
I
good.
agree with you. There is, but this is the one we got.
Yeah, I think that's it would be interesting to go down, but there's still so much more that I want to learn about Judaism, and we were talking about the afterlife in general. And I've heard the idea said before that sort of, well, Judaism doesn't really have an afterlife. That sort of develops later on in the New Testament when I'm speaking with Christians. But it seems like you're saying that there is a concept of afterlife, but maybe it's not very well described.
It's not well described in the Hebrew Bible. In the Talmud, which is in the time of Jesus and later, a little earlier than Jesus, a little after Jesus and later, it's mentioned on almost every page, constantly mentioned the world to come. So we know that early Israel was exposed to the idea of the afterlife because, after all, Egypt is like the capital of mummification and pyramids and afterlife. But for some reason, and maybe this is why, it did not really capture, and that's why it's so.
There's a slight mistake with him going for the Egyptian understanding, although Egyptian culture obviously did have influence on Israel. I think he should have gone with the Babylonian influence.
In the Bible, but by the time of the Talmud, which is probably 50 BCE and onward, it became fairly fully developed.
Well, why do you think it only develops sort of later on in this tradition?
I don't know. My sort of very uneducated intuition is, over time, the corporate fate gave way to the individual fate. And if you can think of, it doesn't matter what happens to me as long as the people of Israel is okay or survives, then the afterlife isn't so important. But once you think, hey, it really matters what happens to me, then actually the afterlife takes on a whole new significance.
You said there were a few instances in the Hebrew Bible where an afterlife is sort of referred to or mentioned. What does it say?
Daniel chapter 12, it says, some will awake to everlasting life. So that's like that's the most explicit mention of the afterlife. But Daniel is
to the arguments between the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Is a later book.
On.
Much
yeah,
later
sure. In your vision of what to expect when somebody dies, I'm interested just in your personal views, because some people have this idea of you die and your soul just sort of instantly ends up in this new place called heaven. Some people imagine that you'll be sort of asleep until some kind of physical resurrection. Do you think this afterlife will be a physical one? Will you have a body? Is it a spiritual one? What do you expect?
I will say, because Judaism has an idea of physical resurrection, I like, in theory, I like the idea of physical resurrection only because that's a way of saying a body is not a bad thing. And I approve of thinking of bodies as good things as opposed to repositories of sin. But I find it impossible to believe that actually there'll be physical resurrection. I just can't wrap my head around it. Although in the Talmud, again, it says, if God can make somebody from dust, God can make somebody from the remains of somebody, which makes sense. Nonetheless, what I would say is,
from these rocks, I can recreate. I can give you family lineage, make a whole new people just from these rocks.
Couldn't imagine this world before I came into it. I didn't, eyes and tuna fish and hotel rooms, and it's way beyond me. So how could I possibly imagine what another world would be like?
Yeah.
This is part of science fiction is almost always an extrapolation of what we already know, because we, by definition, can't imagine things we don't know. And so I when I want to be homiletic about it, which I do from time to time, I quote this parable that opens a book about Jewish mourning, about two twins in a womb. And one of them believes there's a world outside the womb and one doesn't. And the one who believes it says, of course, there's got to be another world. And the one who doesn't says, we've never known anything else. We've never seen anything else. He says, now imagine that the one who believes it is born. Back in the womb, his sibling is mourning a death. But outside, they're celebrating a birth. And that's what it's like when you die.
I've heard this story before.
So do you think it is similarly inappropriate or irrational to mourn when people do die?
No, because for the most part, what you're mourning is your loss of them. I think people are less often mourning the person than they are the loss of the person.
Yeah, so I've heard this response before, because this comes up as an objection. A lot of people say, oh, well, you think you're an atheist, you don't act like an atheist, you believe in morality, you believe in conscience, you must really believe in God. And my response to that has been to say, well, you mourn when people die.
Right.
And people do say to me, well, it's because of the separation. But the story I give there is to say, imagine that, a really close friend of yours is moving to Australia, or they're sort of going off on a spaceship somewhere. But for whatever reason, technology
Right.
will not permit you to ever contact them again. They're getting on a boat, they're going off somewhere, and you'll never be able to speak to them again. They're going to have a whole new life somewhere else, and they wish they could talk to you, but you just can't for some reason. And then they get on that boat, and then you learn that halfway to wherever they were going, the boat sank and they drowned. I think you'd be more upset, even though in both cases you were going to be separated from the same amount of time. It does seem like we do get upset about something to do with death, and if you really believe in an afterlife, it seems like you're perhaps doing so irrationally.
So I think it's an interesting thought experiment. I would say in some ways, yes, although I think that part of the reason why you mourn someone who died is because it is an ineradicable separation and one that you can't explain or understand. And
Correct.
And the other reason I think is that you can
One's more permanent than the other. One, there's a greater chance of running into them again.
believe. And by the way, I have met people
And one has
who
more
literally
mystery than the other.
don't mourn because of
right.
belief in an afterlife. Like their belief is so strong, they really don't mourn someone who dies, which I find really
Kind of eerie.
hard to believe, but it's true. And I think that it is the mysterious, almost the spooky inexplicability of you were here today. That's why people always say, but I just spoke to him yesterday, as though people that you speak to yesterday don't die. There's something uncanny about it that makes it different, I agree, from like going to and even if there's a life somewhere else, it's still uncanny. It's still hard to believe. And that's one of the reasons why I would have people come to my office and they would have been married 50 years, 60 years. The person's 90 years old, and they say, this is so unfair. It's so wrong. And it's because the emotional shock of death is so immense.
Talk to me, if you don't mind, about the challenge posed to Jewish theology by the rising of Christianity. Here's a religious tradition that says, look, we have these historical texts, these texts which are really well historically attested, that a man died and rose from the dead and claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. In the face of somebody who says, this is a historically tested event, this, if what he was saying is true, then you should accept this man as your Lord and God. What do you say in the face of those ideas?
So, I mean, this is, as you can imagine, this has been debated for thousands of years. The principal thing I would say is, look, the Jewish community was there.
Talk to me, if you don't mind, about the challenge posed to Jewish theology by the rising of Christianity. Here's a religious tradition that says, look, we have these historical texts.
A lot of Jewish ideas came after Jesus because the rabbinical system that developed after Jesus, after the fall of the temple, is amazing. And a lot of medieval Judaism gives us a lot of modern Jewish ideas. So it's important to note that.
These texts which are really well historically attested, that a man died and rose from the dead and claims to be the Jewish Messiah.
With Christianity,
in the face of somebody
it
who
keeps on
says,
developing. Judaism doesn't just stop with the advent of Christianity. It keeps on developing.
this is a historically tested event, this, if what he was saying is true, then you should accept this man as your Lord and God. What would you say in the face of those ideas?
So, I mean, this is, as you can imagine, this has been debated for thousands of years. The principal thing I would say is, look, the Jewish community was there. They met him. They spoke to him. They knew him. Somehow, he didn't make the impression. Like, if God's walking on earth, you would think more than 12 people would say, oh my God, that's God's walk.
Yeah, a lot more than that did. 500, to 5,000, to 77, to 72. A lot of people did. So yeah, no, he's underplaying it, but he has bias. So
Walking on earth. So I think that Christianity actually has a bigger burden than Judaism. If God literally walked the earth, why didn't the people around him recognize him?
I wonder, I don't know how much we can know about, the proportion of people who actually met and interacted with Jesus.
Well, you have in the New Testament the Jews saying, gathered around the cross, and Jesus walked among the Jewish community and was a Jew. And so it seems to me a really difficult, unless you want to go the route of the Jews are wicked, which many Christians did for a long time, precisely to explain this difficulty.
Why they wouldn't.
I think that it's harder for Christians than it is for Jews to explain how this guy proved to be relatively ineffectual.
So I think that looking at, for instance, the accounts,
very effectual. I mean, Judaism was almost completely destroyed and only survived while Christianity thrived. So, yeah, Jesus was incredibly effectual. So, again,
the resurrection, I'm often told that what we have is a sort of group of eyewitness testimonies that people claimed to see Jesus after he died. And the people who saw Jesus were quite limited. I mean, Paul seems to suggest that 500 people saw Jesus at one point, but he's appearing to his disciples. And so for the wider community of people, all that they actually had to go on when it comes to the resurrection was the testimony of the people that saw him. They didn't actually get to see Jesus for himself.
No, but they saw Jesus walk in the world. Was Jesus not special enough for the majority of Jews to see that God is actually walking on earth? And also, even if 500 people, I mean, we don't have that kind of, there's no testimony in Jewish sources at the time, which you would think there would be, because after all, there have been other false messiahs in Jewish history. Forgive me for calling Jesus a false messiah, but that's how he's seen in Jewish history. And they were very widespread.
You're right.
And like Shabtai Tzvi in the 16th century, 1600s, swept across the Jewish world. And people who met him were immediately impressed and thought, oh my God, this really is the Messiah. So the bottom line is, I don't think that Jesus is a theological challenge to the Jewish tradition. When people ask me how Judaism sees Jesus, we see him as a teacher who said some things I agree with, some things I don't agree with. There are lots of reasons to me why Jews didn't accept Jesus as anything more than a gifted teacher and spinner of parables and a committed Jew.
And on the idea of things that are morally, let's say that's the sort of historical case about who Jesus claimed to be, but also talking about his moral teachings, you say there are things that he said you didn't like.
Yes.
Especially given the fact that you say he's a committed Jew,
right?
But here he is saying things that you don't like. What are some examples of the things that he did?
Abandon your father and mother to follow me. I think that's not a principle that I would.
That's kind of the point. You have to abandon your old tradition to come with the new tradition.
Adhere to, or when he curses a tree. I mean, there are.
He's God.
Some things about Jesus that I would explain as a Christian the way I explain.
There are some Jewish parables there and some connections that you wouldn't like.
Depredations in the Hebrew Bible, which is this is an ancient person, and he has ideas of his time just like they did 1,000 years before.
That's sort of what I was about to say, is that you can point to the character of Jesus and say that the fig tree didn't have any figs, and so he cursed it and it died. That's very strange and seemingly out of accord with the character of Jesus.
It matches with the story. So it's saying that it didn't produce fruit, and therefore, if it doesn't produce fruit, it doesn't have true faith, which goes back to faith without works is dead. It's a theme that is also explored in the epistles. It is a very Catholic theme, and it means that you have to have fruits, not just be grafted in. You actually have to produce fruit. You have to do work. You have to follow his commands. The works don't save you, but you have to do them to remain saved. That's what it is. You have to produce fruit.
Or certain things that he says, you'll be forgiven for absolutely anything except blaspheming the Holy Spirit. That you'll never be forgiven for. And it's sort of like, whoa, it sends a shiver down your spine. But I mean, somebody could just say, as you said of elements of the Hebrew Bible earlier, look, I mean, there are things that people tried to record that they either got wrong or that he didn't actually say, and that's sort of going on in the New Testament canon as well. Yes,
I mean, that's if a Christian wants to make that argument, I have no problem with it. Look, I am a promoter of Christianity in general. That is, as the creator of the West, I think Christianity has given enormous benefits to the world, but theologically, it doesn't. I remember when I was in 8th grade, we had I went to a Jewish day school, and they brought, to their credit, a Baptist preacher to tell us the theology of, and he told us that we were all going to hell. He said, look, you're nice boys and girls, but
and he was a dick.
I want you to know that you have to accept Jesus too, which, okay. It was good for us to know that theology existed in the world. I don't think it did us any harm. But I remember saying to him, I thought I was going to try to catch him. So I said to him at the time, is Jesus perfect? And he said, yes. I said, is God perfect? And he said, yes. And I said, is the Holy Spirit perfect? And he said, yes. And I said, well, by definition, perfection doesn't need anything added to it. So 2 of the 3 of them are superfluous. And I still find, I understand that the contradiction is built into Christian theology. But for someone looking from the outside, it makes much more sense to have one unitary God than to have a Trinity. And so I don't have a problem thinking of Jesus as just a person. It fits with my theology, and it fits also with my philosophical approach to religion.
Judaism has a lot in common with Islam in that sense, in that respect, in its treatment of the figure of Jesus and the message of Christianity. I mean, I think Islam will sees Jesus as a prophet and sees the Gospels as containing important information, just that they've been corrupted, whereas Judaism would say he's sort of religiously irrelevant.
Jesus actually, right, exactly, does not play a big, like in my Jewish education, it was just not, he wasn't important. People didn't talk about it.
In
it was equivalent to Muhammad, right?
Yeah, which is where there is an important diversion between those
Yes.
two world religions.
Right.
One of the things that Christianity did was have a sort of debate in its early church about what sort of Jewish practices and Jewish customs needed to remain after Jesus. And so Christians no longer observe the same food laws. They no longer circumcise their children. Do you feel like that is a terrible mistake? I mean, how integral do you think that these elements are to Judaism? I mean, we spoke earlier.
It's a terrible mistake if you want to be Jewish. It's not a terrible mistake if you wish to be Christian.
Well, we spoke earlier
It works
about
for- it works for
how
Christians.
I said, do I need to believe in God to be Jewish? And you said it sort of depends on who you're with. But immediately you said no. I mean, do I need to be circumcised to be Jewish?
You are, if you're born Jewish, you are Jewish whether you're circumcised or not, but it is a mandate of the tradition to be circumcised.
So it's a mandate to be circumcised, but not a mandate to believe in God.
Well, both of them are mandates of the tradition, but you asked me, could you be Jewish without it? They're both mandates.
sure.
Of,
Okay,
I mean,
I see.
the first of the 10 Commandments is, I am the Lord your God. So it's pretty much a mandate of the tradition. But if you don't believe in God, then they don't say,
You're
you
still
are
a
no
Jew.
longer Jewish. Right?
But just to clarify then what we were talking about earlier, if you are a Jew, you should believe in God.
I think so.
You think so?
I do.
Can we talk about circumcision? Where this comes from? Why?
All
why
I know is it comes from the
evolves?
Bible, and it was supposed to mark in your flesh the covenant with Abraham and all the generations that followed. And I suppose that it came from like the idea that a mark in the generative organ would be carrying the seed forward, and that's where it came from.
But there's not there's not like a go-to agreed upon explanation of why specifically this action is the way of indicating.
Well,
the
it's only
covenant or
it's agreed
respecting
upon
covenant.
only in the sense that it was done to Abraham.
Yeah.
So that's
I've heard. I mean, a lot of people make this criticism of Judaism. This sort of picture this circumcision as a form of genital mutilation, and a lot of people are very troubled by this. I've seen it sort of debated back and forth. I know Christopher Hitchens made a big
Yes,
song
he
and dance
did.
about
I
this
know.
too. I mean, you must understand that criticism. I'm sure he said at one point, and I don't know if this is true, but he said that Maimonides writes that the purpose of circumcision, at least in part, is the dulling of sexual pleasure.
yes. Well, Maimonides was an extraordinarily important and gifted, probably the most important Jewish philosopher and legalist. Like many rationalists, because Maimonides was a thoroughgoing rationalist in a medieval age. Like many rationalists, Maimonides was not particularly positive about things of the body, despite the fact that he was a doctor. So yes, Maimonides probably did believe that. I don't think he had any evidence to actually say that that was true. And for thousands of years, it does not seem to have significantly impaired the ability of Jews to reproduce and have children. So I would say if somebody came to me and said, should I circumcise my child? And then there's not a religious imperative to do it. I would say, look, the World Health Organization says you should, which they do, but I'm not going to tell you you should do it. But as a
No, you
religious
shouldn't.
imperative as a Jew, I think
Unless
it's an
you're
important
Jewish,
statement
you
to make.
shouldn't.
I saw a debate once between Christopher Hitchens and somebody representing the Jewish religion. I can't remember who it was. And they're talking about circumcision, and his opponent makes this joke. He says, well, it seems perfectly safe and fine, and the only effect that it seems to have on people is increasing their statistical probability of winning a Nobel Prize. Yeah. And everyone laughs. And he says, oh, my son cried more at his first haircut than he did at his brisk, right? And they're sort of laughing. And Hitchens says, I don't find the compulsory genital mutilation of children a fit subject for humor in the same way that you do. I mean, imagine if I were to say right now, my daughter cried more at her first haircut than she did when I cut off her clitoris.
Right.
What would you think of me to say such a disgusting, evil thing? And then he said, and you've just proved my point. You've proved my point that religion makes morally normal people do and say wicked and evil things. You've just proved my point. And the audience erupt in applause. What do you make of that exchange?
First of all, I think that to call circumcision genital mutilation, like thousands of years of Jews would disagree with you. And there is no evidence that it dulls pleasure, unlike a clitorectomy, which Judaism has never practiced and doesn't practice. And I think that while it is true that any ideology, and everybody bears ideologies, not just religion. Any ideology can make people do things, sometimes bad things, that they would not do otherwise. I mean, when I had this debate with Hitchens, I would always say, like, Marxism hasn't made people do bad things. Fascism hasn't made people do bad things. Anything that someone believes deeply can make you do bad things. I don't think circumcision is a bad thing. And I think the vast majority of adult men who've been circumcised would agree with me.
You can understand why that would put off new converts, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, by the way, I don't know that that's by design, but I think that there is something to that, which is it is actually an awesome thing in the traditional meaning of awe. So that is full of awe to join the Jewish people. We have not had an easy time of it in this world.
I think so. I agree.
And it's not something I
That's
think that
kinda
should
cool.
be done. I
also think it's awesome to
welcome
become
converts, and I
Catholic.
think it's wonderful for Judaism to have converts, and they add immeasurably to Jewish life. But I think it should be
Or
done
Orthodox,
soberly
that-
and thoughtfully.
I must ask you in
It's a major
closing
thing.
about Christopher Hitchens.
Do I care about the Christopher Hitchens thing? What do you guys think? I think I'm done with this one. Let's see what's next. We're still going. Let's go a little bit longer. Let's pick something else. Let me see. What do I want to do here? You know what? I have not given this guy a try. Let's check out this guy. Okay. I said I would, so let's do this guy's videos. Let's see what he's got. I don't know that it's going to be any good. He interviewed a guy who I really enjoyed interviewing
of the YouTube
myself,
channel.
So I'm hoping this guy is decent.
Majesty of Reason, a channel ran by Joe Schmidt, a current PhD student at Princeton who somehow is already a published author. Joe's resume is seriously impressive.
I'm married a PhD. My families have PhDs. I don't care about PhDs. I'm so cool.
And so when I saw that he was doing an AMA and Ask Me Anything, I knew that I wanted to leave him a question. The first question that came to my mind was, probably unsurprisingly, religious in nature. See, I knew that Joe, like me, grew up Catholic and is currently agnostic. So I wanted to ask him why. What made you stop calling yourself Catholic? Joe answered my question during his 3-hour-long AMA, and in this video, I would like to share Joe's answer to my question, if for no other reason than I think it's super cool that Joe actually took the time to respond to me. Let's begin. Here is Joe reading and responding to my question.
No music. You understand?
Non-traditional Catholic. You were Catholic at one point. You were Catholic at one point, but today you're not. Was there some philosophical reason that prompted this? If so, what was it? If the reason is not philosophical, then disregard. Thanks for everything. Well, thank you. So there were all sorts of reasons. I mean, the main philosophical one was the problem of evolutionary animal suffering that led me away from theism.
Me.
As well as difficulties with things like the fall.
Can I tell you what got me over the animal suffering thing? Watching my cat torture, my beloved cat, torture and kill another animal. Once I saw that, I was like, screw being a vegetarian, screw being a vegan. That's just stupid.
Mass atrocities, infernalism, and just a mounting of considerations supporting naturalism. See, for example, the work of Paul Draper and Jeff Lauder's popularization thereof.
If that sounded a little short to you, it's for a few reasons, I guess. First is Joe just got so many questions. And secondly, he actually got a similar question to mine that he answered way more fully.
Oh, what happened?
AMA, so it probably makes sense for me to play that response here too.
One of your top objections to Catholicism is infernalism, the top one. So infernalism is certainly up there, but there are lots of others. There are, of course, general objections to theism that I find plausible, several quite powerful versions of the problem of evil, evidential arguments from religious confusion, lots of others. There are many objections to divine timelessness that I find quite forceful. There are many objections to divine simplicity that I find quite forceful and that I've published on, in fact. There are lots of I don't know if I should say lots of objections. There is at least one objection to creation ex nihilo that I find reasonably plausible. It comes in the form of Felipe Leon's published article. It's either published or forthcoming, entitled like...
None of that. That doesn't matter. We don't know how creation started. Right now our best theory is the Big Bang. Theory could change. It's okay.
The problem of creation ex nihilo, a problem for traditional theism, or something like that. You can find it by searching it up on his academia.edu page. I find that a reasonably plausible argument. There are implausible ethical claims with lots of arguments against them, for example, about homosexuality and contraception. There are Old Testament...
You're wrong.
Atrocities. Now, again, Catholics aren't bound to thinking that those literally happened exactly as depicted in the biblical texts. But there is just the fact that this is simply not what we would expect a perfect being to ensure that it's
all of
depicted
these answers are actually terrible because there's no actual requirement as a Catholic to believe these things one way or the other, literal or metaphorical or allegorical. It's just important that you believe them. It's not important in what level you believe them. Once you assent, you're good. So this is... it sounds like he got tied into either radical traditionalism, some sort of Christian fundamentalism in Catholicism, some sort of maybe charismaticism. Definitely not liberation theology. I like liberation theology. I still do. Even though it might be a heresy, but I still like it. But he definitely was in a realm where he had to be tied into a literalist understanding of certain aspects of the Bible, and therefore he rejected it.
It's doing in its special holy book. And you might think that those other readings are not particularly natural and not particularly plausible, given the relevant historical stuff and Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. There are also objections to the coherence of the Trinity that I have worries about the Trinity and Trinitarianism. Also, to make sense of transubstantiation, you arguably need some pretty hefty metaphysical views about substance and accidents that many contemporary philosophers have challenged on many entirely independent grounds in the metaphysics literature, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So all of these things and many more worry me to varying extents.
None of those are problems.
And so I'm just trying to give you a glimpse into some of the top objections.
Sounds like you were
For the
already
rest of-
ready to quit believing, and you found an excuse, and then you quit believing.
This video, I don't even think that I want to talk about any of Joe's responses specifically. I would like to discuss something a little higher level. I would like to discuss the certainty with which Catholics claim to hold their faith, and why I am both jealous and skeptical about that certainty. In
Come
both
at me,
clips,
homie.
Joe talked
I've
about
already
the various
invited you on my
problems
channel.
of evil, of animal suffering, of modal collapse, and others. He mentioned Felipe Leon, the philosopher who is most famous for his 200 or so arguments for atheism. And again, in an effort to make a video that's actually a little short for once, I'm not going to talk about any of those problems specifically, but rather all of them together. Evidently, there are some very intelligent people, such as Joe Schmidt, people far more intelligent than I am, who take at least some of these arguments very, very seriously. According to the Phil Papers survey in 2020, about 2/3 of philosophers are atheists. And look, I call myself agnostic, but only 7% of philosophers call themselves agnostic, while 19% call themselves theists. So I'm in
I'm a Catholic
the
and a
lowest
theist.
category. I'm in the minority of the minority here. But I think that
mystic, I
I'm
think.
justified in calling myself an agnostic in as much as
Am I a
I'm not an
mystic?
expert.
Wow.
All I'm saying when I call myself an agnostic is I don't know. I am not making a claim to knowledge. But the average religious person does make a claim to knowledge. When I was growing up trad, we would sometimes talk about the virtues of a
You shouldn't have been trad. That sounds to me like the big problem.
simple faith. We would say that there was something virtuous about fostering a medieval form of piety in which we simply paid no attention to the Vatican. We definitely didn't get involved in philosophy. We just would pray the rosary every day, go to mass confession once a week, and that's it. But what I don't understand is how anyone fostering that medieval sense of piety, which I would argue is more common than Catholics who do read philosophy and stuff like that, how they can have any kind of
Misa read philosophy. Misa read good. Misa read for you. Good philosophy.
certainty in something as simple as whether or not God exists, much less about whether that God
He does.
is triune or whether the Catholic Church specifically is the one true church. There are simply too many variables for my cute and smooth brain to come to any kind of solid answers on any of these questions. And that isn't for lack of trying. I read philosophy. I read apologetics. I read the writings of the saints and of the church councils and papal bulls.
Misa do too. Misa think you wrong.
And all of that. Hopefully my channel's history demonstrates as much. And I read these things,
I know my channel history does, but then again, you got probably more subscribers than I do.
as much as I can. I am not a grad student working on a degree in church history, such that
We'll get into that later.
all of my time is spent reading these materials. I do have a real job, but I also don't have kids. So I probably have more time to dedicate to this stuff than like a lot of other people, you know, in their late 20s who are married. My point here is that I think that I am at least as well read as your average Catholic when it comes to philosophy, writings of the saints, papal bulls, etc. But despite me being roughly as equally well read as your average Catholic, I do not have the same level of certainty in my beliefs as the average
Yeah, but you're coming
Catholic.
from trad, so I kind of feel like you're not talking about the average Catholic. You're talking about the average rad trad, and I would like to challenge you on that if you ever get on my channel or if I ever get on yours.
In fact, I feel way more uncertain about probably all of my beliefs compared to your average Catholic. Frankly, the more that I read, the more agnostic I become. And I just don't understand how it is that people who read roughly the same amount as me, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, are just so certain. Again, PhDs who've dedicated their whole lives to this stuff, sure, I get it. Maybe they can be certain because they're just far more intelligent than I am. But for you guys, the people who are viewing my channel,
Thank you for calling me intelligent, even without a PhD. I'm flattered.
You and I are probably roughly equally well read, roughly equally intelligent. You might have more confidence than I do if you're one of my Catholic viewers. If you are, can you tell me how it is that you have such certainty? Is it...
Let's see. I was killed when I was in 4th grade. Heart completely stopped, jumped by at least 3 guys. I had my airway closed, had an outer body experience. Went through about 100 deaths before I was 13 years old, including my mother and sister. Drove off a bridge that wasn't complete and lived with 2 of my friends, so they were witnesses, not just a thing. Let's see, what else? Lost my ability to walk to diabetes. Going against doctor's advice, got off medication, prayed to God with a conditional, was able to walk again within a year, actually within 6 months. Let's see, survived a cancer scare, I should say. It was Hyper pylori, but I was bleeding internally for a long time, for years. I was like a bowl full of blood. It was really gross. Lost all my income. Gave up all my possessions 3 times. Somehow got them all back. Let's not get into that. Was a religious and was living almost as a monk for 3 years after I gained back my ability to walk. After I was 13, at least once every year, or twice every year, someone in my family died, so I had to deal with a lot of death all the way up until maybe 22, 25. Let's see. At 24, 25 is when I had my cancer scare, dropped out of college, lost all my income due to the medication and everything else and the cost of going through that. Rebuilt my life, lost my ability to walk around 30, gained my ability to walk back at 33, got super healthy, got a wife, got a life, got a great job. Now my dad has dementia. I'm dealing with that. Let's see, what else? Have friends who have had miracles happen to them. I've seen miracles, experienced miracles, lived through miracles. My father has seen the dancing of the sun. So has my aunt, who was a religious. They went to a pilgrimage to, I believe, Medjugorje. And in the pilgrimage, I don't know if it was at Medjugorje or if it was in Rome, but they saw the dancing sun. So yeah, there's more. There's a lot more. So yeah, I know God's real, whether or not the Bible's true or not. So I'm not really worried about whether or not the Bible is correct, because I know God is real.
Is it that all of these Catholics, all of these kind of average, equally well-read as me Catholics, has everyone had some kind of religious experience, which is just kind of like cementing it for them? Like in the empirical, like, hey, no, I had this experience and now I know that, I know that God exists with as much certainty as I know that you exist, Kevin, because I experienced it with my own eyes or whatever. Yeah. Is that the case?
For me.
I mean, I guess that I thought that I was having religious experiences too when I was Catholic, but like looking back at it, it wasn't like...
It wasn't when I was Catholic when all this stuff happened. I left the church at 13 due to bullying and a predator. And I came back at age 33 because I asked for my ability to walk back, and I got it. And there's other miracles, but...
religious experience. I was never seeing anything or hearing voices. I just kind of like had a peaceful feeling. Does that peaceful feeling?
There is no peaceful feeling. There is no burning in the bosom. There's intellectual assent and there's faith. That's it. Those are your 2 ways to get there. And intellectual assent alone is not enough to get you into heaven.
Count as evidence for you to believe in? Is that what is doing it? Or are you getting something more? Like, were your experiences just way better than mine? That's what I'm interested in learning from my Catholic listeners. What is making you so certain? And is it religious experience? And if it's not religious experience, what is it?
That wasn't a good video. It's okay. It's non-trad, right? It's non-tradcath. Is that this guy? Am I looking at the right guy? That's the question. I think it's the right guy, right? Non-tradcath. I can't even see. It doesn't even show. I'm assuming it's the right guy.
One of those stories was the life of Saint Dominic
Haven't
de
been
Guzman,
impressed
whose
yet.
story is also the origin story for the Rosary, a prayer.
Oh, 32. Darn it. I don't want to do a 32-minute video. Let's fast forward this a little bit faster.
The way that I was raised growing up was I was read the lives of the saints instead of like fairy tales or Aesop's fables or I don't know, whatever normal kids read
That sounds like it sucks. I feel bad for you. Sorry.
growing up.
I read comic books. My dad didn't read to me, but I read comic books. I also read the children's Bible, like 3 different ones. It's one of them that I really liked. But comic books, and then before comic books, I didn't really like reading. So I think I read my first comic book around 12, 11. So before that, didn't read. Wasn't my thing.
Stories was the life of Saint Dominic de Guzman,
Watched a lot of Transformers and G.I. Joe, although I love Transformers way more.
whose story is also the origin story for the Rosary, a prayer that my family prayed every day in my house since as long as I can remember. In today's video, I want
to feel sorry for you.
talk about the origin of the Rosary and how the open secret about the origin of the Rosary is kind of embarrassing for the Catholic Church. And I'll also touch on any broader implications that it might have as well. Let's begin. If we wanted to learn about the Rosary, I feel like a good place to start is the holyrosary.org/rosary history. Since the Rosary is composed principally and in substance of the prayer of Christ and the angelic salutation, that is the Our Father and the Hail Mary, it is without doubt the first prayer and the principal devotion of the faithful, and has been in use all throughout the centuries, from the time of the apostles and disciples down to the present. It was only in the year 1214, however.
Oh, get me to something interesting.
Record, the word secret, I think, still does apply here. I never heard anything other than the origin story that we just heard when I was growing up, and I don't think that you'll really ever hear a sermon about the stuff that I'm about to share with you. However, if you go looking for these details, they are not hard to find. You will find them with like any quick Google search. I mean, like Wikipedia summarizes what I'm about to share with you, like right on the Wikipedia page for the Rosary. So it is an open secret. It's a secret as in nobody talks about it, but it's open because the information is not hard to find. Let's go to the Catholic Encyclopedia. The Catholic Encyclopedia entry on the Rosary says the following.
If it's in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it's not hidden. That's apologetics. You're dipping your toe into the exact poison you say you're the antidote to. Makes you a hypocrite.
When the Albigensian heresy was devastating the country of Toulouse, St. Dominic earnestly besought the help of Our Lady, and was instructed by her, so tradition asserts, to preach the Rosary among the people as an antidote to heresy and sin. That many popes have spoken so is undoubtedly true, and amongst the rest we have a series of encyclicals beginning in 1883, issued by Pope Leo XIII, which, while commending this devotion to the faithful in the most earnest terms, assumes the institution of the Rosary by St. Dominic to be factually established. We will confine ourselves here to the controverted question, you see that right here, of its history, a matter which both in the middle of the 18th century and again in recent years has attracted much attention. So even just in this first paragraph, we see that the history of the Rosary is controverted when the Catholic Encyclopedia presents the traditional story. And then it adds the phrase, so tradition asserts. Then there are several paragraphs of non-controversial information about the Rosary. But then the Catholic Encyclopedia does admit, in any case, it is certain that in the course of the 12th century and before the birth of St. Dominic, the practice of reciting 50 or 150 Ave Marias had become generally familiar. So it was common to say 50 or 150 Hail Marys before St. Dominic was born. And meditating on the mysteries wasn't part of the Rosary until long after St. Dominic was dead.
This is all well known. And if you listen to any monk who practices the Rosary or is part of the brotherhood that this guy belonged to, they admit as much. So you were just in a bubble of people who believe nonsense, and you were fed nonsense, and you're upset about that. But that has nothing to do with the actual history or the actual facts. You were duped, but you were a child, so it's not your fault. It's your parents' fault. Go get angry at them. Don't be angry at God. Become a Christian. Go back to being Catholic. Just don't be rat-trad.
The introduction of this meditation during the recitation of the Aves was rightly attributed to a certain Carthusian, Dominic oppression. It is in any case certain that at the close of the 15th century, the utmost possible variety of methods of meditating prevailed, and that the 15 mysteries now generally accepted were not...
You should really look into the Orthodox version of the Rosary. It's not called the Rosary, eh? And also, it's just the prayer beads. It's really good tradition. Also, you can look into the Tibetan or Buddhist version, which is also just prayer beads, because prayer beads is an Eastern idea and also a desert idea, and our religion is a desert idea from the East. That covered it.
Not uniformly adhered to, even by the Dominicans themselves. To sum up, we have positive evidence that both the invention of the beads as a counting apparatus and also the practice of repeating 150 Aves cannot be due to St. Dominic because they are both notably older than his time. Further, we are assured that the meditating upon the mysteries was not introduced until 200 years after his death. What then, we are compelled to ask, is there left of which St. Dominic may be called the author? These positive reasons for distrusting the current tradition.
All right, so I guess when you found out that Mark might not have written Mark and that some of Paul's letters might be pseudo-Paul, I guess that really broke your faith, huh?
Tradition might, in a measure, be ignored as archaeological refinements if there were any satisfactory evidence to show that St. Dominic had identified himself with the pre-existing rosary
Why does
and became
any amount of development scare off rat-trads and Protestants? You guys really need to get over yourselves.
It's a puzzle. But here we are met with absolute silence. Of the 8 or 9 early lives of the saints, not one makes the faintest allusion to the rosary.
Okay, so here's what I need. Here, hold on. Let me, because I don't want to show my address. Let me make sure that I'm... hold on. Let me raise this up a little bit more. There we go. Okay. So here's what I'm dealing with, guys. Okay. Here's my thing. Okay. So. No, let's not do that.
Rosary.
Stop
We
doing
possess
things that I don't want
hundreds,
you to
even
do.
thousands of manuscripts containing devotional treatises, sermons, chronicles, saints' lives, etc., written by the friar preachers between 1220
Don't
and
show my address,
1450.
you piece
But
of
no
shit.
single verifiable passage has yet been produced which speaks of the rosary as instituted by St. Dominic, or which even makes much of the devotion as one specifically dear to his children.
There we go.
Impressed by this conspiracy
Yeah.
of silence, the Bollandists, a collection of Catholic hagiographers, so they wrote Lives of the Saints.
I
The
need,
Bollandists, on trying to trace to its source the
two
origin
new-
of the current
and
tradition,
two more
found
rats.
that all of the clues converged upon one point: the preaching of the
Looking
Dominican
at a
Alan de
skateboard.
la
I have
Rue about the
skateboards. I
years
used to build
1470 to
skateboards in Jackson. I
1475.
kinda wanna get back
He,
into it.
undoubtedly was, who first suggested the idea that the devotion of Our Lady's Psalter, 150 Hail Marys, was
You know,
instituted
getting
or
this.
revived by St. Dominic. Alan was very earnest and devout, but
I
as
need
the
to get
highest
some
authorities
goggles,
admit,
'cause
he
where
was
I
full of
ride, there's,
delusions
like,
and based his
bugs and
revelations on the
insects
imaginary
come right in my
testimony of
face.
writers that never
I'm not
existed.
really sure which one of these to get. I'm
The
thinking
encyclopedia
this
goes
one.
on to admit that back in the time when it was commonly believed that the
Well, I'm not
the
sure.
traditional origin story
thinking that's
for
too
the
much, right?
rosary was true,
Maybe a
that there
baklava
were
might
several
be fine.
documents that were circulating as
I
proof
already have
that Our Lady
gloves up,
really
but I
did
just
appear to
like
St.
the fact
Dominic
that
and
these
really
are
did
black.
give him the rosary.
And I need a helmet because I
But
don't want
those
to lose
documents
my
have
teeth.
problems. Let's read about that here.
I'm writing crazier and
Two
crazier,
considerations strongly support the view of the rosary tradition just
I
exactly.
go into, like,
there
ditches
are
and, like,
considerations that strongly support the view
I
that the
don't wanna lose my
rosary
teeth if I
did
flip.
not originate with
So
St. Dominic.
I want
and that would
a
be
face guard,
the
but
the
I'm not
surrender
sure
of
if I
almost
should
every
get
notable
one
piece
like
that
this,
has at one
like
time or
this
another been
one,
relied
or if I
upon to
should get one
vindicate the
that's
supposed
open.
claims of St. Dominic. Memoirs have
Yes,
long ago
I am
been
gonna get
proven
these
to be
two.
a
I already bought
forgery.
one
The famous
Hebrew
will of Anthony Serge,
thing.
which
I will
professed to
get
leave
to
a
it.
bequest for the Confraternity of the Rosary in
And then I
1221,
need to get
was put
something to
forward
carry
as a
my
conclusive
milk.
piece of testimony for the truth of
I
this
bought one
origin
here, but
story
it
of the
was not
Rosary,
good. I got
but that
this
is now
one.
admitted by Dominican authorities to be a
And then I'm gonna buy
forgery. It's been
these
admitted to be a
two.
forgery since 1901.
And I want
Similarly, a
this.
supposed reference to the subject by
And I
Thomas
need
A.
those.
Kempis in the Chronicle of Mount St.
I
Agnes
don't need that, but I
is
want
a
it.
pure blunder, something else that's been known since 1901. And look, none of this is
And
new
I need some
information.
new ones for my
One
next
of the two
one.
main sources that the Catholic Encyclopedia cites is Scriptores Ordinis Praedicatorum. I probably said that wrong, which was published in 1721. It is available in full from the Internet Archive, but unfortunately it is a scan of a text in Latin, meaning it's not searchable.
Are these any good?
so that makes reading it pretty tough unless you're fluent in Latin, and it's like a grainy scam at that. My Latin is very rusty.
This
But
is
if
my wish
there's someone
list,
who
by
wants
the
to
way.
like fact check the Catholic Encyclopedia, be my guest. And apparently, in well-educated Catholic circles, such as my buddy Kyle Whittington's Discord server,
I wanna
this
get
is
a French
common
Bible.
knowledge that the origin of the Rosary is a myth. When I asked the Catholics in Kyle's Discord server, like, did you guys grow up hearing this story? They said no. They said, like, wow, Kevin, I can't believe you actually grew up like learning that. But if this
Yeah, I
information
agree.
is so public,
I-
and if the well-educated Catholic
I am telling you the same thing. You were brainwashed by idiot parents. I'm sorry.
are all already on board with all
I
of this,
have
they
an
kind
idiot father who's a genius. He's a genius in music. He's a genius in financing. He's a genius in investing. But when it comes to religion, he was not the brightest, sharpest tool in the box, brightest light in the light bulb section. He just wasn't. He was great at other things. Your parents might have been super religious and good at other things, but not great on religious history, and they fell for a suckerish thing. Hence, they were rat trats. If they weren't able to fall for something suckerish, they wouldn't have been rat trats. You think people who are rat trats are idiots? Do you think your parents are idiots? No, I don't think so. So, instead of judging your parents for being wrong about their over dedication to a incorrect sect within a subsection of Catholicism and being angry at religion for it, forgive your parents, forgive yourself, go back to the church, and be okay.
of just don't care, then how is it that I grew up the way that I did? And why is this secretive at all? Well, I guess I could blame some of the fact that I grew up hearing the story on the fact that like the internet wasn't in any of our homes back then. And while that is true, and while that probably has something to do with it, there's more to it than just that. Let me show you what I mean.
Well, this particular priest, we'll call him Father Dominic at that point, he went on a preaching campaign to go against them. And he
Them referring to the Albigensian heretics again.
thought with his ability to speak, he'd be able to conquer them easily. But
So don't go to rat trap priests who are basically heretics. I don't know. Maybe an answer.
he wasn't able to. And he was pretty bummed out. So he went into the forest to do like a retreat in southern France. And he prayed and he asked heaven, I need help, I need help. And that is when tradition says, popes have said, Our Lady came to him and said to him, preach my psalter.
Did you catch that? Tradition says, probably referring to that sermon from St. Louis de Montfort, and popes have said, I assume referencing all the encyclicals from Pope Leo XIII, as well as the work done under Pope Gregory XIII. Does the priest here, Father Calloway, does he go on to say later in this speech that the story is recognized as myth today and that we have really good reasons to think that none of these things really happened? No. I recommend that you watch Father's sermon. It is linked in the description down below. It is an hour long. The first 20 or so minutes will cover most of the context that you will need, but not all of it. Later in the sermon, Father does go into like the Battle of Lepanto and stuff. The Battle of Lepanto is a topic for another video. Maybe I should make one on the Battle of Lepanto. But Father's point was very much so that we should believe the origin story of the scapular. You can see that at the roughly 15-minute and 48-second mark. Father starts talking more about why it is that we should believe it, and like maybe I guess why we shouldn't believe the people who say that we shouldn't believe it. Listen here.
The Black Plague in Europe in the 14th century was a result of Satan seeking to get rid of this. The weapon had been unsheathed. He wanted to destroy all documentary evidence associated
That is a stupid thing to say. That is crazy. Why would you believe that?
with it. And by the way,
Did you hear that? Satan sent the Black Plague to Europe to try to get rid of the rosary, and he wanted to destroy all documentary evidence.
But it's not his fault for saying it. It's your fault for believing it. Take some personal responsibility. You're the sucker. He's just the con man.
It's associated with the rosary, and
this is like
It's not associated with the rosary. It's associated with the crazy person's understanding of the rosary, with the con man's understanding about the rosary. I love Grant Cardone. I love Jeffrey Gittimore. I love there's like two other guys that I like listening to. But I know they're bullshitting, and I'm not about to throw them my money. I'll read their books, but I'm not going to take one of their courses unless I have the money already to spend on their course. Yeah, it's great motivation and their ideas work if you're already successful. But I wouldn't recommend someone who's broke spend all their money on a course on Grant Cardone. I wouldn't. But a salesman who's selling cars, who doesn't feel motivated, who doesn't want to make phone calls, let's go make Grant Cardone phone calls. You're a rat trad. You already believe this crap. Go listen to this guy. You'll feel great. He's a confidence man. When I say con man, I don't mean criminal. I mean confidence man. He has confidence in what he's saying, and he's giving you confidence in what you believe. Confirmation bias through confidence. Now, I love Grant Cardone. I listen to Grant Cardone. When I sell, I listen to his closes, and his closes work. Generally, they do. But I could spend $20 on his book, or I could spend thousands of dollars on his course. I would spend $20 on his book. And if you don't like what he says, throw it away. This guy's giving away this for free, and people are buying it. But Grant Cardone will get you maybe $1 million. This guy ain't going to get you anything, and he won't get you into heaven either. So, again, problem with your parents, problem with yourself, problem with your own confidence in yourself and your own belief and your own understanding of the Bible. Not a problem with the Catholic Church, problem with this particular priest.
Frequent tactic of the evil one. When some new form of devotion is given to the world, he will seek to burn the original documents.
Isn't that convenient? When a new devotion comes out, if there are origin documents that support the mythos around the origin, then great, we have the origin documents. But if we don't have the origin documents, well, that's because Satan was doing his best to destroy all of the evidence of these origin documents. That's right, Satan himself sent the Black Plague to...
Okay. Do you believe that Satan's real? If you're a Catholic, yes, you do. Do you believe that the devil can do bad things? Sure. Do you believe the devil really has power? No. So already his theology's messed up. Ignore him.
Europe to eliminate or erase all the primary sources on the scapular. Come
And him being wrong doesn't disprove Catholicism. It just disproves rad-trad nonsense.
on, Father. It's really hard to take this seriously. Let Father keep talking here as well.
After that happened, in 1903, Leo XIII dies.
He's taking an expression seriously.
Modernism strikes hard.
Yep, that's that, late 1800s modernism, yep.
Oh, big time hard.
Big time
And where do
hard.
they go on the attack again? This. As soon as Leo XIII died, the scholars...
Seriously, like I need goggles. See, I have little sunglasses. I need to get the wraparound sunglasses. That would probably solve part of my problem. But I also need like the mask so I don't get the bugs in my mouth. And I want the helmets that way I can do big dips without having to worry about breaking my teeth.
come out and they start saying, it's legendary, it's not true, it has no foundation in reality, there's no historical documents. Right, because they were burned. What does it take to get into your head?
What does it take to get into your head? Satan is trying to hide all the documents of the origin of the rosary. It's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, this is what Father is saying. Don't listen to anyone who disagrees with what I say, because everyone who disagrees with me...
Yeah, but you're doing the same thing. Okay.
TLDR, we're running a...
You literally have other Catholics telling you that no one heard this. So you're the only one, or your family, or your tradition is the only one that fell for it. Sorry?
of all this, as convenient for folks who would love to use this to prove that the papacy is false or something, like as convenient as that would be, I don't think that really works here.
Well, you're even coming to the same conclusion that I'm coming to, which is that you're making a hill of beans out of 2 or 3 beans. There's nothing there, man. There's no there.
Was mistaken about the origins of the rosary, and he wrote about his mistaken belief in the origin of the rosary in a couple encyclicals. Okay. Catholics, by and large, aren't going to tell you that papal encyclicals will be free from historical errors. So Pope Leo XIII was wrong about history. Okay, no sweat off the backs of any...
Nobody cares. Okay, let's move on. Last one. This is going to be the last one. We'll finish at the 2-hour mark. Again, I'm sorry for starting late today.
In this video, I thought I would offer my unasked for thoughts on the conversion of Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity to Catholicism.
This is a good one. This is a good one to end on.
You might expect me to say something bitter or to try to convince him not to, but I won't, and not just because Cameron will never watch this video.
Well, also because the form of Catholicism that he conformed to is not the form of Catholicism that you practiced or know of.
I say this because Cameron is doing exactly the same thing that I did when I stopped practicing my Catholicism. And what is that thing? It's our best. All we can do is the best we can do. And I think that Cameron is honestly convinced that the Catholic Church is the one true church. And it takes guts to leave the religion that you grew up in. Cameron will undoubtedly face backlash from the non-Catholic Christians in his life. I know that I faced intense backlash from the Catholics in my life when I left the Catholic Church. don't get me wrong, I definitely disagree with Cameron's conclusion, but in my opinion, the conclusion is way less important than the process that it took you to get to the conclusion. In college, I once took a 2-problem exam. It took an hour and a half to complete, and I got...
Are you way younger than your images make you look? Because
both problems wrong. But I got a B+ on the exam. I showed my work and I made small errors in both, so the conclusion was wrong, but my work was mostly right, so I got a good grade. And I like to think that God is a lot like my engineering professor. I like to think that if God were to exist, God seeing my work and knowing that I did my best, even if my
no, your works have nothing to do with your salvation. You're already wrong.
conclusion was wrong, would be enough. And I imagine that Cameron feels the same way about the Protestant God. If Cameron's wrong and Protestantism was right, I bet you that Cameron thinks that God is good.
No. And Protestants are fully Christian. They can get to heaven too. So, too many rat trad believes.
Enough that he realizes that Cameron did the best that he could do, and even if he got the answer wrong in the end, he did his best, and the work is what counts. I think that this is the real Pascal's wager. We don't get to choose what we are convinced of.
No, confirmation bias exists. Sorry.
But we can choose to follow the truth wherever that journey might take us. My journey led me away from Rome. Cameron's journey led him to Rome. And I can't read Cameron's mind, but he strikes me as sincere.
Oh, he strikes me as one of the most insincere persons I've ever seen on YouTube. So I'm sorry. I mean, you have completely different takes on that.
And all I can really say is that this ex-Catholic, at least depending on your definition of the word, really respects Cameron's intellectual honesty, even if I personally came to a different conclusion. Thanks, everybody.
Your snowball mic sucks. I hear you. I'm coming. My cat's asking for something. So I am going to call it a night.
The prophets.
We're good. We're good. We're good. This is, well, let's see. What's the next one? What's this one? Let's see what it is. Let's see what it is. Let's just see what the video is. I think I'm done. I think this is it. I think we're good. It's a 13-minute video. Yeah, I'm good. I'm done. All right. I love you all. I know I wasn't paying attention 100% to this one today, but I put a lot of work into yesterday's video. Cameron Bertuzzi, Thomas, he was a super big Protestant. He switched over to Catholicism, got way more views, and now his channel's dying again. It seems to be financially based, not spiritually based, and there seems to be some kind of philosophical, intellectual reason assent to reach to God, which doesn't actually work. It has to be through faith. So his intellectual assent will fail, and if he's only basing it on intellectuality, he will eventually apostate. If he does actually get to true faith, where he doesn't have to worry about whether or not he can prove that he's Catholic, then he'll finally be Catholic. But as long as he's only there because Bayesian theory got him there, he's not going to be a truly practicing Catholic. Thomas, thank you for watching this terrible stream. I will be better tomorrow, I promise. I had a very bad night with my dad. Oh, if you want to stay on for a few minutes, I don't work until 3 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow, so I can talk for a few minutes. I just had a terrible evening with my dad. I got home and he had hidden his, well, before I left to work, he had hidden his medication. I got home and he was having issues, and it was a ploy for attention, and it wasn't good. In fact, I have to call my wife after this because she was worried, and it ended up being a non-issue. But yeah, so I kind of powered through this one, kind of answering quickly. I'm going to do the debate again. Tomorrow night, I'm probably going to listen to finish off that debate because I'm really enjoying commenting on that one. But yeah. You have any questions, Thomas, or anything you'd like to talk about? Let me know. If not, I'm probably going to end the stream in about 2 minutes. Yeah, it is. Especially because right now my dad's doing better, and he wants the attention that he got when he was doing worse. So he's, it's kind of like dealing with a child. and the mentality goes down as the disease progresses. So, all right. Thank you, Thomas, for watching. I hope you found this one interesting. I'm hoping the guy who's on camera, I'm hoping to do a video with him either on his channel or on mine. So I'm hoping to interact with him soon. I did do some outreach to him, but my Alexa, Echo, turn on lamp.
Okay.
Echo, turn on library.
Okay.
So I'm hoping to hear back from him again. He said he wanted to do something with me, but I got distracted with other stuff. So anyway, have a great night. I love everyone. Forgive everyone for everything. Remember, God loves you. Remember, God forgives you.